Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm. We are going to be doing a crash course in seed starting today. So if you're just getting started in your gardening journey or you want to learn more about different seed starting options, today's the day we're going to go through everything you should need to know to get started. Let's go. At the end of this video, we're going to go through problem solving and FAQs that I get, so stay tuned to the end. You all know that I talk a lot about soil blocking here on the channel, but it's not the only way to start seeds. Now, there are lots of different ways to start seeds, and some of them are a little bit easier than others. So let's just go through some of my favorite ways. So first off is the most obvious one, which I've just been talking about, which is soil blocking. It's where we literally make little cubes of soil and we start our seeds directly in those cubes. So while you might think that they don't hold together, if you make them properly, they do. And we have lots of videos showing how to make them. The advantages of soil blocks is that you don't have to use plastic. These trays that I use are fiberglass. You could also upcycle any tray or flat surface that you have sitting around. It is nice to have a flat bottom and a little bit of a lip, and then that way you can bottom water right into the tray and pour off any water that is sitting in there after the blocks have wicked the water up. So this is a nice way to go if you're looking for plastic free. Soil blocks also make the healthiest seedlings. So down the road when it's transplant time, when you grow in a soil block, what happens is you get what's called air pruning, which means that the roots hit the side of the soil block and they basically stop growing. So what you get is a nice little dense mat of roots that aren't circling like they do in a tray. So they're healthier seedlings, they make healthier roots, they're more drought tolerant, pest tolerant, they just thrive a little bit more, I find. So that is one option. As soil blocks come in lots of different sizes. Here you can see we have some minis. I usually recommend that you get the medium one that makes 5 soil blocks at a time if you're just getting started or if you're dabbling in home gardening, because these ones that make these medium-sized blocks are kind of the most all range. They fit all different kinds of seeds and they make a nice healthy transplant size. We have a whole nother video where we talk about the different size soil blocks, so just go watch that. And again, if you're interested in soil blocking, we have tons of videos. Just go check out our soil blocking playlist. Another option that you have is the wood trays. So we showed how to build these a couple weeks ago. Wood trays are great because they retain moisture well. So if you are a busy gardener and you don't have a ton of time to be watering your seedlings, wood trays are a great option because you have one big slab of soil essentially, and they maintain moisture very well. So if you're going out of town, you know, for almost up to a week, you can leave these unwatered because they do retain moisture so well. So when you're transplanting these, the downside is you kind of have to scoop them out with a little spoon to transplant, and also you have to find these materials. So often I'll find reclaimed cedar on Craigslist from old fencing or old raised beds, or you could go and buy some cedar. These will last you many years. If you're looking to avoid plastic but you don't want to use wood or soil blocks, you also have lots of other options, including things like all these upcycled fun options. So some that we've made include these little paper pots. You just take a piece of, you could use newspaper, this is recycled craft paper, you just wrap it around a glass and then you kind of take the bottom and scrunch it up, shape it around the cup, fill it with soil, pack it in, and we've started a bunch of stock in these. You can also do old toilet paper rolls. Now, the downside of toilet paper rolls is that they can come unraveled as they get wet. So you really have to pack the soil in there and then try not to overwater. Same thing for the paper containers. I would just top mist these until they're germinated and then water them carefully so you don't overwater. Another fun option if you're looking to upcycle are egg cartons. I've used both the bottom and the top of the egg carton. So here's the bottom part. Same thing here, you'd want to keep them misted from the top until they're germinated. I hear a lot about complaints about these guys getting moldy, so make sure that you're not over watering them. It can be easy to overwater these paper containers. Just top mist until germinated, and then you can water just strategically. Don't douse them with water. All right, so those are a few other options if you are looking to avoid plastic, but you maybe don't want to buy anything and a wood tray is too much work for you. So let's move on next. I want to talk about soil. What kind of soil can you use? So often we go to the big box store, Home Depot or what have you, and there is seed starting soil and it's in a bag. It says seed starting soil, it's sterile and blah, blah, blah. I don't like to use that one. It's used usually because it's light and fluffy, which is good for germination, and then you have to start adding nutrients to it. too much work for me. I would prefer to have something that I can seed start in and I don't have to then do a bunch of work to it, either pot them up into something different or add a bunch of nutrients. So I just start in potting soil. You guys know I use a product called Fox Farms, and it is just a straight potting soil. And it is peat free because I do like to avoid peat, and that's the other reason I don't use seed starting soils, because it often contains peat. Most seed starting soils, at least here in the US. In the UK it's banned, different story there, but here it's in almost every seed starting soil. So I like to use potting soil, and then I don't have to pot up into a different container. So just, if it were me, get a good high quality potting soil. You can sift it if you feel like there's a lot of chunks in it. We have a little sifter. You can sift through it and pick out the big chunks. But you can use that in a tray. We use it in our soil blocks, and we use it in the wood trays. We use it in this, everything. And you can use it in your pots and your outside containers as well. So it's kind of a good all-purpose thing. If you want to watch our recipe and specifically which mix we use, I will link that recipe below. Okay. So that's it. Avoid seed starting soil is my best recommendation. It's expensive and it's not very good. Okay. Next up, filling your trays. So when it's time to fill your tray, what I recommend doing is moistening your soil first, because if you don't moisten your soil first, what often happens is it's hydrophobic, especially if it contains peat. If you do have one that contains peat, it tends to avoid to want to get wet. So if you put your soil in dry, then you put your seeds on, then you try to water, a lot of that will float up to the surface and then your seeds can get lost. So wet the soil first, then put it into your containers, whatever containers you're using. Now for trays and the egg cartons and the little paper rolls, those you would want to use just a damp soil, like a kind of a wrung out sponge texture, moisture level. But for soil blocks, remember you want it to be much wetter. So it depends what you're using. If you're doing soil blocks, you'll want it to be wet so that if you squeeze it, water comes out. If you're using trays, you don't want it to be quite that wet. When you are packing your trays, if you are using, I have one somewhere, if you are using one like this, these are quite popular. They're made out of recycled plastic. I don't love them because recycled black plastic contains a lot of contaminated plastics like dioxins and recycled electronics, which I don't really want near my soil, but that's just me. But if you are using this, wet the soil first, pack the soil in there well, and then give it a little smack. That's going to help settle the soil. Make sure that you're holding the bottom because otherwise the soil will come out the bottoms. Give it a little smack and then top it off and then put your seeds in. Otherwise what happens with these is sometimes that soil comes out the bottom if it's not packed tightly enough, and then you end up with kind of a half full seed container. So wet your soil first before you put it into your container. All right, next step is putting your seeds in. So this step is important to do your research. Now, I like to recommend the Johnny Seeds website for this, because if you go to Johnny Seeds and you go to growing information, they will give you all of the details you need to know for different germination of different seeds. So for example, snapdragons need light to germinate. So these ones we put right on the surface of the soil, but others like our sweet peas actually need darkness to germinate. So those ones need to be buried. So while the general guideline is to cover them about as deeply as the seed is big. So for a sweet pea, if it's about, yay big, you'd want to bury it about that deeply under the soil. But that's not always necessarily true because, for example, some things like snapdragons need to be sown on the surface and have light to germinate. So if that's the case and they need light to germinate, they will often tell you to just put it on the surface of the soil and don't cover. If that's the case, you need to make sure that you are misting every day with a spray bottle to keep that seed moist, because that seed is going to dry out much faster if it's sitting on the surface versus if it's buried under a little bit of soil. Now, when you are burying your seeds, if they need to be at a certain depth, I usually just use a sprinkle of whatever it is I'm using to start my seeds with. So usually for me, that's a potting soil. I just do a sprinkle, depending on how much it's supposed to be covered, over the top of the seeds. You could use something called vermiculite, which is this. No, it does not contain asbestos. It's a myth. Don't worry about that. But you can use this over the top. I just prefer to use seed starting soil because I find it retains moisture a little bit better. But you can use vermiculite for something else that we'll talk about at the end. If it's buried under a little bit of soil, just wet it when you feel like it's starting to dry out. But I do still recommend using a mister to germinate your seeds. Don't pour water on top, because if you pour water on, those seeds are all going to float up to the surface and turn into a mess. So when you're spraying, I also like to spray straight down, not at an angle, because if you spray at an angle, sometimes you can blast your seeds away. So go straight down, and that makes sure that you don't blow your seeds away. We're paying attention to a few different things. One is the light, so does it need light or darkness to germinate? The other one is the depth. And then the last one is temperature. So temperature is really, really important because sometimes we just throw everything on a heat mat, and that does not work because certain things like poppies, snapdragons, stock, broccoli, kale, a lot of cool vegetables and flowers don't actually like heat. For those ones, you would not want to use a heat mat, but things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, you know, warmer temperature, warmer season things, Lysianthus even, they like a heat mat. I don't recommend just any heat mat. We have tested some and found that they get up to almost 100 degrees, which is too hot. So if you're going to use a heat mat, say for example that your seedlings need 70 degrees to germinate, that you can usually achieve at room temperature. So in general, we want to think that our soil temperatures are going to be about 5 to 10 degrees below what the air temperature is. So if your home is set to 70 degrees, it's pretty likely that your soil temperature is going to be about 60 degrees. So it's probably going to need a little bit of warming. But to get it up 10 degrees, usually you can do that just with a light. So like a fluorescent light, and set your seedlings nice and close to the surface of that light, and that will be enough heat to get to around 70. Anything beyond that is where you're probably going to want to use a heat mat, and not just any heat mat. Like I said, I'm going to want you to use one that has one of these, okay? So with this, you can actually set the temperature and you can tell it how warm you want it to get. So you can set it to a very low temperature instead of just plugging it in and then hoping for the best. These also have a little probe. So you can stick this little probe in and it will actually go right to the temperature of the probe. So you could stick this into your soil in your container or in your blocks, and you could set it to whatever you want it to be, and then you know you have the right temperature. It is very important, okay? So don't skip over those things. I know it seems like, oh, I'm just gonna throw these seeds in and keep them wet. And they need either light, darkness, the right temperature, the right depth to germinate, otherwise you might have problems. So once you have your seeds in, you have your heat mat on, you want to keep the humidity in, especially if you're in a dry climate like mine. So a lot of times the seed trays like this, or the plastic ones, will come with a top that goes right over it. If you want to use those, that's totally fine, that's up to you. Myself, I prefer to avoid plastic, so instead my preferred method is to use a piece of this. It's just a cotton fabric that I've coated in beeswax, and we showed how to do this in our wood seed tray building video. We just take beeswax pastilles and we melt it onto some cotton fabric, and then we just place it right over the top of our seeds until they've germinated. It lets enough light through if it's a light fabric that they will still germinate if they need light. And then you can also do it in a dark fabric if it's something that needs darkness to germinate, but lots of flexibility there with sizing as well. So you can cut these to fit whatever it is you are using for a tray and keep that on top. Now you can also use things like scrap plastic. So say, I'll often save like the plastic from various wrapping, you know, food products or whatever it is, and just use those to cover over the top. We want to keep a humidity dome on, so some kind of plastic, some kind of barrier to help keep evaporation from happening until those seeds have germinated. Once they've germinated, and I mean most of them have germinated, not just started to germinate, you don't want to take it off when just like 5% have germinated. Wait until at least half of them to 75% of your seeds have germinated on the tray, and then you can go ahead and remove your humidity dome. If you do it too early, they're going to dry out, and then the rest of your seeds probably won't germinate, especially if you're in a dry climate like mine. Keep that humidity dome on until about 75% or more have germinated. Hopefully if you're keeping the conditions correct, they'll all germinate right around the same time. So once you've removed that humidity dome, you're going to want to make sure you have your lights set up. So lighting is very intimidating, and I understand that lights are very scary because there's all these different lumens, all these different numbers, so much to think about. I just use a basic shop light from Costco. It's an LED shop light, which means these bulbs are very low energy. They heat a little bit, but not very much. And the trick is to keep them close to the surface of the seed. So usually we're looking at, if you're doing indoor seed starting and there's no natural light, you'd want them to be about 2 inches from the surface of the light. If you are doing outdoor seed starting like I am, or if you have a southern facing window, then I can set them a little bit further away because they do get extra light from the sun. But in general, with the LED shop light, you want to go about this far away from the top. And again, these are just from Costco, very basic, that FEIT Fight brand shop lights. Okay, you don't need a fancy, expensive grow light. And you'll want to keep that light on around 16 hours a day and then off for about 8 hours a day. So if you're like me and you forget to turn them on and off, just set it on a timer so that it kicks on and off at the right time. But this is key. Don't skip the light because usually when we're seed starting, there's not really enough daylight hours to keep them from getting leggy, even if they're in a greenhouse like this, which is why I have lights still, even though we're outside. If you want to see more about our shelf setup, we have a whole video when we seed started in our basement to show how you can set up a shelf and do this inside in your basement. I'll link that video down below as well. Once we have our seedlings germinated, they're under a light. And then what we want to do is we want to set up an oscillating fan. So a fan is going to do two things. One is it's going to help make our seedling stems a little bit stronger. It replicates the wind, and so it's kind of like a tree. If a tree is never subject to wind, it gets kind of spindly. But if it has to deal with wind, the trunk thickens to deal with that. Same thing happens with seedlings. So we want them to be exposed to a little bit of wind. It's going to help thicken and bulk up their stem. So we can do that either by, brushing our hand over it a couple times a day, but a fan is going to help more because it also is going to help with things like algae accumulation and mold accumulation and also fungus gnats. So fungus gnats tend to not like to land or be able to land on soil when there's a fan in the area. So a fan can help if you're dealing with fungus gnat issues. Okay, that's pretty much it. Now, as they're growing, so assuming that you've gotten them germinated, you want to keep them moist until you see that first set of true leaves. Don't follow the recommendation to let them dry out a little bit until you see their true leaves. When I say true leaves, let's look at stalk as an example. So when stalk first germinates, it looks something like this little one right here. This doesn't really have true leaves yet. Now this one here has two sets of leaves, and this has its true leaves. Once you see those true leaves starting to appear, that's when you want to start letting them to dry out just a little bit in between waterings, because if you keep them too moist all the time, you're going to run into a problem with algae. Algae is not uncommon. Don't let it panic you. And if you get algae or you get mold, don't toss your seedlings. You don't have to throw them away. Okay, so problem solving. Let's go through kind of in order of probably problems that you would see. So the first one that you'll probably see if you're seed starting is mold or algae. So usually mold looks like kind of a white fuzzy substance that's starting all over the surface of your seedlings. Don't let it panic you. You don't have to toss out the whole batch. Instead, what you'll want to do is take off whatever your humidity dome is just for an hour or so, put a fan on in the area and let it blow that mold. That will help just to keep that at bay. So if you can just remove your humidity dome, if you are getting some, just remove it for about an hour or so a day, and yet make sure that you're keeping your seedlings misted. So you don't want your seeds to dry out, but you just want to get some airflow going across the surface of your soil. Usually it's related to that airflow. So if you can keep that fan on in the area, that's going to help with mold. But again, if you do get it, you don't have to throw out the whole batch. Just try to get that fan on there, take off the humidity dome until that mold goes down a little bit, and then go back to misting. The other one is algae. Algae is very common, especially if you have something that needs light to germinate, because algae actually feeds on moisture and it also likes light. So in the absence of light, algae doesn't do well. So algae is going to be one that you're going to see on seedlings that need light for germination. So if you start seeing algae, there are a couple things you can try. One is that vermiculite that we mentioned. So if you sprinkle a little vermiculite over the surface of your soil, it works by basically crowding out the light access for that algae. So we're trying to crowd out the light. So you can use that. You can also use cinnamon, and we've done cinnamon in the past. It does work quite well. We've had a very, very incredibly terrible attack of algae on some stock seedlings that I forgot to take the humidity dome off, and the cinnamon took care of it right away. So for extreme cases, go for the cinnamon. If it's just a light case of algae, I would use the vermiculite myself, because cinnamon does have antifungal properties, and we use mycorrhizal fungi in our recipe and in our seed starting mix, and it's in our soil. So I don't like to use it if I don't have to, because I don't want to put a fungicide, and even if it's a natural one, on my seedlings, if that makes sense. And the next one that you're going to see is legginess. Legginess happens in the absence of enough light. So if you don't have your lights either close enough or on early enough, that's when you're going to run into leggy seedlings that are all spindly and flopping over and looking very sad. So if that happens, you can try to salvage it by pushing them down with a little toothpick. Make sure that the soil is damp before you do it. Take a toothpick and just gently press the stem down deeper into the soil until it's buried up higher on the neck. That will often help if you've caught it early enough. Now, if you haven't caught it early enough, it might not help, but it can help, again, if you've caught it in time. But in general, what I say is, if you know that they're about on the day that they're supposed to be germinating, so say your seed packet says they'll germinate in 7 days. On day 6, go ahead and turn on your light. Make sure it's set low enough, because if you miss it and you don't get time to check and see if they've germinated. And then even if you leave them for one night without light, they can get leggy very quickly. So have the light ready to go. Don't wait until they've germinated. Be on top of that light situation. And again, nice and close to the surface of your seeds. Not way up here. I don't care how fancy your grow light is. I have seen very fancy, expensive grow light setups where they're way up here and the seedlings are leggy as heck. So put it down closer if you're using the shop lights. Just trust me, okay? I've done this for like 5 years and 50,000 seedlings. I got you. Okay. And then the other problem that I see very commonly is yellowing or slow growth. And usually this is what I see when people use that seed starting soil. So this is why I said, don't use seed starting soil. It is very poor. I'm sorry to say. It is just bad. It's bad stuff. It's just for germination, and then you're supposed to prick it out and pot it up into something else. So just save yourself the work. Germinate it in the potting soil, and then you won't have to do all of that extra work, and your seedlings aren't going to yellow. If you do find that they are yellowing, so if you're here because you're like, crap, they're already yellowing, then you're going to want to be fertilizing with a teaspoon of fish emulsion per gallon of water almost every time you're watering, okay? So try to do that if you are using seed starting soil. If that's all you have and you have some from last season, then just immediately once you start seeing that first set of true leaves, start fertilizing your seedlings. So get that fish emulsion going, and you can ramp up that ratio a little bit as the seedlings get older. So you could go up to maybe like 1.5 teaspoons per gallon of water once they get, third set of leaves. And so again, I don't need to fertilize my seedlings because we use the potting soil with the wool in it, which has a slow release nitrogen in it. If you're like me and you don't want to do fertilizing, then just go back and watch that video and grab that recipe. Otherwise, yes, you will probably need to fertilize. And that's why you have yellow seedlings. Okay, wow, that was a really quick and dirty crash course. Seed starting 101. I want to make sure that everybody is successful. So if you have questions, please post them down below. And I am going to also link our soil blocking recipes, our seed starting recipes, and our shelf setup so you can see all of those below. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful weekend and full of seed starting. I will see you guys around here next time at the farm.